Um, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Lewis Wheaton. And Lewis and I have known each other for many years, and we met, I think, at a number of praxia meetings, as well as probably many other scientific meetings, and we share a strong interest in praxis movements and phantom limb phenomenon. And we were actually co-authors on an apraxia treatment paper in 2008. I'd kind of forgotten about that. Dr. Wheaton is a professor in the School of Biological Sciences at Georgia Tech and the director of the Cognitive Motor Control Lab, and has an adjunct appointment in the Department of Rehab Medicine at MRRI. He received his BS in biology from Radford University and PhD from University of Maryland in neuroscience and cognitive sciences, and was a fellow at the Baltimore VA for a while. And Lewis is also very active, not just in a scientific capacity, but as John just alluded to, he's also been very active in several scientific organizations, most notably American Society of Neurorehab. And he's also got one of his other hats is an involvement in policymaking. He was a governor-appointed member of the Georgia State Rehab Council, and he's also active in local politics. He's a council member in the city of Smyrna, Georgia, his hometown. And so we are delighted to welcome Dr. Wheaton today. And I don't have the title of your talk pulled up, so I'll let you introduce that. And you should be able to share your screen now.
Great. Let's see. Hopefully we're good. Hopefully you can see that perfectly fine. Yeah. Great. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks, Laurel, for the introduction. We definitely go back several years. I was actually thinking about that this morning. I think I've known you nearly all of my professional career, which is pretty cool. And certainly good to meet you all. Today, we'll talk a little bit about science. If you want to know about municipal budgets, I can talk about that too. If you want to get deep in the weeds of something incredibly boring, we can do that as well. But I'm more than happy to be able to hang out with you all for a little while. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work we're doing that kind of oscillates between basic science and neurorehabilitation. I always remind people and tell people I am at the core of basic human neuroscientist who is really, really, really interested in neurorehab and really trying to understand how we can use concepts that we learn from neuroscience to better model rehabilitation for different types of individuals. My world is usually focused on upper limb motor control. And so we're going to go back and forth between some basic science and some clinical stuff that we've been doing related to that. So without further ado, I guess we'll see if we can move forward here. So I always like to kind of bring, I'm a big fan of the history of neuroscience in general. And I always tell my students that are in one of the courses that I co-teach with a few other folks at Tech, is there's this really beautiful history in human neuroimaging that has really sought to understand whether they're motor representations, which you see there on the left, or understanding of tools and objects and various other things on the right. There's a lot of history in the neuroscience of this and what different brain areas are engaged in these types of tasks, whether you're doing motor imagery or you're actually performing a movement, or if you're just trying to distinguish between a tool and a non-tool thing. You see a lot of very common brain areas that get activated in these sorts of tasks, usually left hemispheric, usually somewhere in parietal and or frontal areas, and oftentimes bleeding as well into the temporal cortex. Highly reproducible findings for sure. And this usually invokes to memory and to most people something of mirror neurons. So these particular populations of neural cells within the parietal frontal areas that are active when, let's say, you're grasping for something, or you're watching a monkey. In this case, a monkey is grasping or extends the arm to reach or grasp some food or something like this. that there are certain populations of neurons that have some amount of activity in relation to both the observation, but also the performance of that action. And so this is clearly, work that's done invasively in non-human primates, but we can see very similar things when we do work in upper limb motor control in in healthy humans, right? And so there's a substantial work in this. I mean, there are volumes and volumes and volumes, I'm sure that you're all familiar with, that have tried to understand this question from multiple angles. In some of our own work over the years, we have looked at various understanding of things like action judgment. So you see a scene and whether or not the tool is being used correctly or is it being used incorrectly. And we can look at neural patterns of activation and discern that there are certainly some areas that are more active for tools versus other items, right? And so in this case here, we can see that for actions that are used correctly, we see these red areas light up, so to speak, in human imaging, and for things that are incorrect, much more activation of temporal areas bleeding into the insula, actually, along with certain areas in the mesial-occipital region. Similarly, people being able to make predictions about action with tools and noting, again, these very strong left parietal frontal patterns that are heavily left hemispheric patterns when you're trying to predict what somebody's about to do and whether or not your prediction of what they're doing is accurate or is inaccurate. But likewise, whether it's graspability or tool selection, or even in this case, doing electrocorticography, direct recording from the cortex to really understand motor planning related to reach or grasp, we always see this left parietal frontal activity, which is tremendous from a reliability sense, right? We have this sense that, okay, we know it's going to be there. It's almost an easy hypothesis in some cases. But I think one of the criticisms that people often point to with this is we still don't really have a strong idea of what this activity actually represents. We can speak to certain patterns related to tool selection or action encoding and things like that. And as I speak to a lot of my good friends, I was in a seminar meeting probably about 3 years ago, and it was really focused on this kind of very common finding of left parietal frontal activity. And all of the more animal researchers in the room were always very curious because they said, this is such a predominant and strong pattern. Does it mean that you're actually recording what you think you're recording? Or is this something else? Is this some more generic activity of some other network, but we just happen to be looking at parietal frontal cortex and thinking it's something to do with tools? Fascinating criticism, but it leads to an interesting, curious thought for us, and that's really trying to understand what this activity really means, and is there an explanation that could actually be profitable for the use of rehabilitation? And so hopefully you can kind of hint from that we think there is, but it's a matter of trying to figure out exactly what it is. And so what we'll talk about today is some of the approaches that we take in the lab to try to understand these patterns of activity and what they're really meaning and how to harness them. So in my lab, the bedrock of most everything we do is still neurophysiology. That is still kind of at the core of my being, but we're very interested in thinking about biomechanics and also computational approaches and how to marry these concepts together. And so what I'll talk about today are 3 studies or 3 themes of studies from 3 of my former, 2 former and 1 present, soon to be finishing up PhD students that looked at things such as prediction of judgments of action goals and tie that into this concept of perception and action coupling that Bill Cusack has done. And then finally looking at this during skilled action, which some tie into some basic science work and some rehabilitation work that we think has some really good meaning. So one of the things that we got really excited about, really through serendipity, about 5 or 6 years ago, was a better understanding of how the visual system works in all of these studies. One of the common themes with uh, a lot of our paradigms, and not just our paradigms, but a lot of other individual paradigms out there that study these networks, is that they happen to involve a visual stimulus. And that means typically, in most cases, the eyes are free to vary in certain patterns. And so we wanted to understand more about these eye movement patterns themselves. And we certainly know that eye movements for upper limb motor control is a very long history. This is just one very quick example of this. I've always liked this particular study because in this case, a person is basically allowed to saccade to, they start as a point, they saccade to a target, and they come back, and then there's a reach equivalent task there. And so what you see is as their hand moves, which is in the black line, you see that their eyes jump and they actually end up being anticipatory to where their arm is going to be in time. And so the idea here is basically that to be very simplistic about it, the eye is somehow theoretically leading the hand and is sort of guiding the hand is one interpretation towards this task that you're actually doing with your implement. What you also see, though, is that these eye movements tend to align to the trajectory of the action, which is an important finding because we also wondered about this from a perceptual point of view. So, not just when you're doing an action, but when you're seeing an action or seeing what you think might be an action. Do we also see similar eye movement patterns when somebody is trying to understand the trajectory of an intended tool object interaction, let's say, right? And so we wanted to understand this a little bit more in the motor perception world. And what we did was this really started with a study that was a collaboration with Anna Borgi and myself, um, where we wanted to understand some things about how contextual and grasp specific tool use is perceptually evaluated in a very quiet, just behavioral response. Is there a way that we can really understand how context and grasp specific information is encoded? And we did this by very simple visual stimulation, starting with this core image here. This is just a spoon and a scooper and a cup of yogurt. And the question basically the participants were tasked with was to determine whether or not the tools and objects go together or not. Very simple. And it was a binary response that they had to have. So in this case, these are all correct because the tool and the object align. And we also included a hand in the image and a hand grabbing the handle, then also a hand grabbing kind of the bowl end of the spoon, so to speak. And this is called manipulative grasp because not only does it really interfere with the tool and the object together, but importantly, this grasp in context would only be meaningful if you were like moving it around. So in other words, you're manipulating the tool somehow beyond its functional use. Odd name, but we were trying to come up with the right wording. And there's that. I have a long story about that if you care to hear about that. We also match this with things that are incorrect. So again, not a functional use necessarily. And then spatial, these have sugar packets over here with a spoon. And so these may not necessarily be used directly together, but they're in the same visual scene. And the basic result of this was simple in that we looked at reaction times. In this case, I'm showing you the reaction times made with the hand, where we see that the reaction times are significantly longer for the images that show the manipulative hand grasp, in particular, as well as those in a functional context also were quite longer. So in this case here, the core idea in the hand, when it's in the manipulative grasp, it does interfere with their latency of that reaction time, their ability to make the determination of what is correct and incorrect here. As well, if we had them do the task with foot switches, these reaction time effects disappeared entirely. There was absolutely no effect of this. So this suggests that this is a more of a limb-specific interference effect. We want to do a follow-up of this, again, getting back to that visual system idea to understand how eye movements might play a role here. And so, like we said, we kind of hypothesized that there's this interference effect of this manipulative grasp that maybe offers some confusion about why that grasp is there, that is completely independent on the tool and the object being used together, but it is still interfering with the decision about that action. So the hand certainly is a vital characteristic in the scene. And so with eye tracking, we can actually identify whether or not that's true because we can see what they're looking at. And so what we did here in this particular study, again, using some healthy participants, we basically looked at we divided the object up, the visual scene up into various areas of interest. And we just modeled their fixations and their saccades, whether they're saccades within an object or saccades between different areas of interest. We're able to model these out to look over time. How do their eye movements evolve over the space of the action? And here's an example of one of these images. And so time zero is when the stimulus is right when they make their first eye movement after the stimulus comes on. And you note here that their eyes go straight to the object, and then they go to the manipulative end, and then they drop to the functional end, and they go back up to the manipulative end. There's a gap here because of a saccade, and their eyes go back to the object. And so we can model this circuit, this pathway of the eyes, and do this for each one of those image classifications, and do this also over all of our participants repeatedly. All right? And so this is generally what we see, right? So we look at the probability of their eyes being in any one of these areas of interest. So in this case here, the probability is quite high that they start on the object first. And then it falls down into the point where now the manipulative end is one of the more likely possibilities. But importantly, the functional end of the object, that handle end basically, is never a predominant feature. And we can model that here. So for this particular image category, when the tool and object are correct, most of the bias is toward the object on this diagram. This is just a simplex. The center here suggests a point of equivalence between all image categories, but if you're skewed toward this end, you're more likely to be in the object, likewise manipulative end or the functional end. And so we can look at this for another image category. And the notable thing here is that the functional end, the handle end, suddenly becomes somewhat important. But as well, we can also see it here, right? So in this case here, the data are being pulled more towards equivalence, thus the functional tool end is more important. And likewise for the manipulative posture, we can see now that most of the spread is toward the manipulative end of this simplex. And this suggests to us that indeed there are certain predominant features of gaze that are quite important depending on the object classification that you're seeing. What we really found more fascinating here was how this data clusters. So what this is a clustering of the eye tracking data to look at what patterns are the most pronounced patterns that fall out. And in this case here, these are abbreviations. I forgot to add in the designations, but basically the summary of this is the manipulative grasps tend to cluster together, the no hands all statistically cluster together, and the functional conditions all statistically cluster together. And so this suggests here that visual encoding of the action is based on the grasp features that are being performed. And thus, anytime you have certain properties of the grasp that are seen, those tend to organize how gaze is influenced. And that was really interesting to us because perhaps it explains why the manipulative grasp is so interfering. It seems to be collectively interfering in a similar way for all of the manipulative grasps.
Can I interrupt with a
Absolutely,
clarification? Oh, thanks.
absolutely.
I just might have missed the task in the
Hmm.
eye tracking
Hmm.
experiment. Were they asked to decide whether the tool and the object went to go together?
Yeah, that's it. Yep,
Same thing.
same
So,
thing.
because I guess I was, well, I can save my, would you rather save questions to the end? How's your time? Or would you rather interrupt with
That's fine.
questions?
Interrupt is fine. That's great. That
Okay,
works too.
okay, cool. So how did you make sure that it wasn't that the hand is occluding a critical part of the object? So when the hand is on the manipulative end, it's kind of hiding it, making it harder to tell what that tool is. And that might, those early looks to the manipulative end that are then occluded by the hand could explain the longer RTs
Mhm.
in your prior experiment when people are based on the kind of manipulative on the manipulative end.
Yeah,
Did
absolutely.
I?
I understand. Yeah, totally get what you're
Yeah.
saying. So one of the things that we did actually when we first designed this study, I didn't mention it, but the data set that of the images that we drew was from a normed set of images that included the manipulative postures. And so what we wanted to do was make sure that individuals didn't necessarily think that the manipulative posture was hiding a feature of the tool or the object, because we took those pictures with incredible care to make sure that wasn't the case, but also it wasn't more visually complex. And so one of the questions we asked when we did the norming procedure on a separate group of people was whether these images more visually complex or more loaded or more difficult to understand. And the ones we selected were the ones that were not more visually loading based on the participant experience. But yeah, this was something that we definitely took great care to hopefully make sure was not an influential factor. Yeah. So we followed this up as well with another study using EEG to understand this. And one of the things that we did was we actually designed two experiments in this study. The first experiment was to make the visual stimulus so short that it would basically inhibit an eye movement. So we wanted to see if we can inhibit these eye movements, or in the 500 millisecond experiment, allow the eye movements to still occur and determine whether or not parietal frontal activity was engaged in either one of those experimental classes. And that would help us to understand the core question here, which was, does the gaze pattern itself influence the parietal frontal activity that we're seeing very commonly in these types of studies? We did many studies related to this paradigm with EEG and even fMRI. We always saw parietal frontal activity of varying degrees. And so the real question is okay, is this parietal frontal activity somehow related to the eye movement patterns themselves? And so what we did was we wanted to track eye movements, and this is an average example of the eye move. This is all the aggregate data, I'm sorry, of the 100 millisecond and the 500 millisecond experiment. And in this case here, you see that their gaze basically stayed in the middle, which is where fixation cross was, that they had to stare at. They absolutely had to stare at this for this paradigm. In the 500 millisecond experiment, again, here's the fixation cross where most of the gaze was, but you can see they were able to go back and forth between the two within that 500 millisecond time window. What is also kind of fascinating is that individuals tended to make saccades even after the stimuli disappeared in the 500 millisecond time window. They never really did in the 100 millisecond time window. What's also important to know here is that participants were just as accurate about the tool object pairing question in the 100 and the 500 millisecond experiment. Didn't affect their accuracy. So we're thinking that certainly they used some sort of peripheral vision in order to extract the information in the 100 millisecond, but in the 500 millisecond, they actually utilize their eye movements to some degree to help facilitate that decision. We can also see this quantified when we looked at their eye movements over time. We see for the 500 millisecond experiment, the first saccade tended to be right around the 250 or so millisecond mark. Second saccade tended to be around the 400 millisecond mark. So they were able to at least make 2 saccades before the stimulus went away. In most cases, a few that were a little bit longer, but those were pretty rare, actually. People were quite quick. As well, we know that in most cases, the gaze tended to go towards the object first and then go towards the tool. So in this case, the gaze tended to go to the object, which was always on the left, and the tool, which was always on the right. So that was a normal gaze pattern back and forth between the stimuli. We looked at EEG activity in this, and I'm only going to show this mapping up here because so you can see it. I'm not going to walk through all these head plots. That's insane. But we did look at the neural activity, and particularly we were interested in parietal frontal activity relative to the stimulus onset. Now, we look at this neural activity in a different way. All right, what we did was we said for the 100 millisecond experiment, let's do a statistical test to evaluate the main effect of just having a hand in the stimulus and look for that for the 100 millisecond experiment. So the experiment where they're not able to move their eyes quick enough. And what we see here is that there's a basic common activity at about 200 milliseconds in that seemingly is a main effect of the hand being in the scene at all. These areas that we see lit up here of different colors, these are statistically significant areas, and they're all over left parietal frontal areas, a little bit of bleed over into the right hemisphere as well. However, when we allow for saccades, we see that activity getting spread about a bit. So over the 500 millisecond experiment, now that activity comes in 3 phases, and those 3 phases basically align to when those saccades occur. They tend to be basically time locked to when the saccade happens, if not just before the saccade happens. And so we wanted to understand this a little bit more and looked at this. This is a post hoc testing of this again down here. All of this is parietal activity up here. All of this is frontal activity. If we collapse, we'll look at the effect of grasp here. Effectively, the story is that the left parietal areas have 2 different activation points. And for the manipulative posture relative to the no hand condition, a lot more activity in the frontal areas compared to the other condition sets. An important point for us, though, here was to be sure that this wasn't some kind of eye movement artifact, right? The fact that this activity is spread over time could easily suggest an eye movement artifact, and that's something we wanted to also explore in a separate analysis. Dylan, you had a question?
Lewis, excuse me for one sec,
Yeah.
Dylan. I'm sure you've already said this, but on the vertical axis, so going from 10 down to 50, this is just some kind of numbering scheme of anterior to posterior, frontal to parietal, like a kind of.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that, I don't know why that's not showing up. For some reason, it's gone from the images.
I know.
But yeah, this is basically is more frontal. As you work backwards or you work higher in number, they go to more parietal occipital areas.
And the measure of activity is some kind of power measurement, or is it like a what is it
yeah, so this
like
is
an evoked response? How do you quantify
this particular activity that we're looking at here is the power activity. We're looking at this is microvolt activity of the evoked responses. We did a very similar analysis over the alpha band, and we saw very similar results actually to this, just at a slightly different time point.
Thanks.
Yeah. So
while you're while we're pausing, so maybe you're going to do this, but do you think that the manipulative activity, which is more anterior, bears any relationship to the Mizell 2012 stuff you talked about earlier, in which the insula, even very near the IFG, is critical for detection of incorrect actions, tool use actions? Yeah, so
absolutely.
Same thing. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I'm actually not talking about, but we referenced in the paper, is also the laterality of the manipulative grasp activity. While it was bilateral, it was uniquely right hemispheric. And we were really interested in what that meant. And we've done a few follow-up studies to try to understand that, one that we're hoping to publish pretty soon, that we think has something to do with the unique interference effect of the manipulative grasp posture.
No, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So we were able to test this eye movement artifact because we have a condition set where they don't move their eyes effectively. We can determine, one of the biggest problems with the EEG is all these eye movement artifacts that tend to just really cripple your data, to be honest. And what we found here in the 100 millisecond experiment was basically just this common activity around 500 milliseconds after the stimulus onset. All right, so the main effective context here in the 100 millisecond experiment was about at 500 milliseconds. And the main effective context here as well for the 500 millisecond experiment was also around the same time. So it staggers, if you remember, going back to behavioral data and the eye tracking data, the biggest thing that separated these images was the type of grasp that the person saw. And so here, what suggests is that context, when we look at context as a main effect, that is seemingly has a time lock difference effect, whereas the role of grasp tends to have a more time varying effect relative to the stimulus onset. Again, something that we're continuing to look at with other studies to understand the timing of these different effects and how these things are being encoded. But it seems like there's modulation of this activity that is driven potentially by the saccades and how this information is being pulled in visually, right? And so we think this is actually really important. How people bring information in to allow them to make decisions about information that are visually seen is a really unique perceptual process, very commonly studied in a lot of other settings, such as reading and but now we have an opportunity to maybe consider this in the perspective of action as well. And so I want to, there's several studies I could talk about here, but I really want to talk a little bit about all of this from the point of view of more of a therapeutic angle to understand some mechanisms related to this idea of action observation therapy. And thinking about how gaze can be used or gaze can be understood in action observation therapy because of the things we're talking about. How we take in information, how we take in information that we observe, how do we internalize it and turn that into motor action? What does that mean? What does that look like? And are there strategies that we just haven't really considered well when we think about this type of approach? So AO therapy is certainly something I'm sure y'all are very familiar with to some degree. Oftentimes we think about motor imagery and action observation from the same or very similar well, but this idea that through therapy, you have to train people to kind of be very intentional and have directed thought, so to speak, on an action and try to imagine oneself doing it versus observing somebody do an action that maybe you're having difficulty with or you're struggling with to try to help guide your performance of that action. One of the populations of people that I'm really interested in understanding more are people with upper limb amputation. I've taken, again, because of a lot of serendipity, I consider it serendipity for sure. I'm more than happy to share this story later on. This is something that I've really gotten really excited about understanding more and more because of some very unique challenges in upper limb loss in particular. Upper limb amputation obviously changes body morphometry, but it also causes essential changes to motor control, even if you're using a prosthetic limb. Your arm is no longer the same structurally and is no longer the same functionally. You're very limited to the type of prosthesis that you can oftentimes afford, much less it fitting well and all these other things. And you also have these challenges where you have immediate loss of sensation. You have sometimes confounding sensations, all these other problems that kind of get in the way of our challenges. And so one of my grad students asked a very thoughtful question. This is Bill Cusack here with one of my students who was in a prosthesis program, was trying to think about ways that we can better teach people how to use prosthetic limbs. And it occurred to Bill, why do we teach people, after seeing many therapy runs with amputees of various levels and various ages, he asked a very basic question to one of the OTs there in the room. Well, why do you train somebody how to use a prosthetic limb with somebody with their hands? There's completely different degrees of freedom. You're forcing the person to think about things in a very abstract way. Well, why not do it a little bit differently? And so his idea was basically to say, what if we train people instead of this way, which is, for example, the therapist interacting with a patient way, the therapist having sound limbs, why don't we train that person with another prosthesis user to perform this same type of task? And are there ways in which the visual system can actually promote some functional improvements in this type of task? And so he undertook several studies actually to kind of pull this out. And we've been looking at this concept through a couple different lenses. And I think there is an important aspect of this with action coding, because one of the things that we find, going back to this particular setup here, this is what the person sees. And so this is a kinematic representation of the angular displacement at the elbow and the shoulder for these two individuals, right? In black here is the prosthesis user. These are their shoulder angles and elbow flexion extension angles. And this is the intact actor, right? So these are their shoulder and elbow angles, doing a very simple, just turn the object over and back type of task. Very simple, very boring, intentionally not functional. And that's important for this case. And so what we actually found was that what the participant sees becomes what they do. So if you look at the number of individuals in this particular study, the prosthesis users, depending on which group they were in, kind of started to separate, and they copied what they saw. So both of these individuals in the black and the gray line, these are populations of people all wearing prosthetic limbs. The gray people are watching the intact limb, which is doing this and this, and the black is watching their counterpart wearing a prosthetic limb. And the fact that things are so grossly different is remarkable in and of itself, but they follow the pattern of the person that's like them to the best of their ability. What we also see is a coordination. So this looks at the shoulder and the elbow coordination patterns. And so here we see a coordination pattern that has this slope for the prosthesis actor, but it has basically a slope in the opposite direction for the intact actor. That's what the participant sees. What the participants do, again, those slopes are basically the same. And so now we're looking to see, okay, why on earth would this happen? Why would just purely the effect of the limb that they see play such a huge role in their behavioral outcomes? I'll apologize in advance if you hear a dog. That is the pitfall of being at home and with kids at home now that school is out. It is very likely you'll hear a child at some point and barking as well. So all apologies. We do what we can during a pandemic. So this is really curious for us to understand what's happening here. Why would this happen? So crystal topping, shown here, and Reagan Lawson and a few other of my students that were one in the DPT program, one in the MSPO program, wanted to understand this more, to say, okay, what is the role of the visual system to understand these benefits of a matched limb training? And again, importantly, we don't ever tell the participants in these studies to pay attention to any particular thing. We just tell them, you're going to see a task and do the task. It is very simple, very straightforward. And so the individuals wore a prosthetic limb, and they either saw somebody with sound limbs perform the task, or they saw somebody wearing, in this case, it was a prosthetic limb simulator performing the exact same task. And this was repeated over 3 blocks. So you observe for a while, and then you make some movements back and forth, and then you observe again, and you do that for 3 runs. And we wanted to understand a couple areas of interest, and these were a priori based on some other findings that we had, but we wanted to know how gaze works, particularly here at the shoulders. And we say the shoulders because this prosthetic limb is powered with shoulder flexion, basically a movement that you pull the shoulders together and it causes the hook to open or close at the distal end. And you can see the harness here. There's a harness here, and there's a cabling system that runs behind their back and runs up through this alongside the socket to anchor here, right on this end. And when you flex, that opens the hook. And so that shoulder movement is actually really, really, really important if you're watching another prosthesis user, and it's irrelevant if you're watching somebody with sound limbs. Your shoulders really aren't super helpful for this task. We also wanted to understand how their gaze followed the object. And so the ability to go above this barrier here that's in front of them, and their ability for their eyes to just kind of go back and forth between the endpoints of the action, the easiest path of understanding the goal, the start and the endpoint of the action. I always like to show this image because it really reflects basically what we found here. For the matched or the mismatched training, in either case, what we see here is for the matched users, the gaze tends to go above the barrier between the start and end points, and also falls on the shoulder much more compared to the person with the sound limb. Interestingly enough, the gaze here, it's really on the face, but it goes basically back and forth to the task board repeatedly. And so this suggested to us very quickly, we're able to quantify this. I'm not going to show all of that, but we're able to quantify that the gaze actually does go above this barrier very routinely in the matched case and onto the shoulders, but actually fails to go to the shoulders in the mismatched, and really actually only goes between the start and the end points. And so importantly, we wanted to know, is this a functional benefit? Does this actually help the user? And I think we're able to show that it does. One of the important things here, we looked at some really basic kinematic outcomes with individuals in this, and across trials, we see the peak height of the matched training group go down. We see also their peak velocity going up, as well as their lateral trunk movement going down. And that's really important. The ability to stabilize the trunk as much as possible to keep down a lot of extra movements is a really hard task for a lot of upper limb amputees. The peak height, though, is fascinating to us. And that really reflects the fact that they're able to basically get to just about the height of the task board before they don't really go much lower. So they're able to increase their risk of bumping into that task board, of that barrier, I'm sorry, while increasing their peak velocity that happens right around that same time. So this is really interesting to us and shows that perhaps the matched limb group are willing to engage in more riskier movements where there's a greater chance of failure. As well, we were able to identify some relationships between their gaze probability on their shoulder and their peak velocity. So again, this idea that you can move faster with much more confidence, their likelihood at any point that the gaze is on their shoulder really is strongly correlated in our initial analysis, is very strongly correlated with an increase of their peak velocity. However, in the mismatched group, probability on the shoulder is incredibly low, and thus they're maintaining pretty steady velocities. We're looking at this longitudinally in a separate study that we're looking forward to resuming as our restrictions are changing and our environment is changing. to be able to better expand on this. But this is very preliminary right now, and we need to do some more work to flesh it out. And so this really comes back to a point of what is the how of action observation? Is there a story really in that we can really point to, that we can make sense of, as to how the eye movements may be helping to improve motor behavior in an action observation setting? It may not be as simple as just the action observation or even really the activity of action encoding parietal frontal areas. It might be more in how the action is being observed. What are you seeing? What are the people kind of extracting from the visual scene that is actually helping their motor control and their motor learning? And as well, does gaze alone shape parietal frontal activity to prime or promote motor learning? Those are questions we're looking at, but I will allude to one study here as we close up that we've done over the last many years. This is a huge effort and a very unique collaboration of some work that we're looking at that actually looked at this question of how gaze may support strategy development in individuals, and is from the world of stone tool making. This is a collaboration with Dietrich Stout and myself. Dietrich Stout is an anthropologist at MRRI who studies how people turn basically a blob rock like this into something like this, something that is much more functional and purposeful. So how do people learn how to make these tools, these stone tools, through archaeological evidence? And what actually helps them develop the motor skills to actually perform this task? And so what we had individuals do over about 100 hours of training was to learn basically how to do that skill. Do not ask me anything about this skill. I know absolutely nothing about stone tool making, having done this study, but it is a fascinating window in basically how you take objects that look like this, using implements like this, to turn it into something like this. And so over 100 hours of training, we tested, we looked at neural activity, which I won't show, but we also looked at eye movement activity while they were learning how to do this task and while they're observing somebody else perform the same task. And so the somebody else that was performing the task was an expert flint knapper, somebody that is very proficient at doing this and does beautiful work, actually, with this task, a colleague in Scotland. And so this is just a basic image to show, for a starter, somebody that's just doing this, this is what the end result usually is, which is, to be quite honest, it's a hot mess. There's nothing functional, reasonable, or logical with this as the result. This is more of what you want at the end. And so after about nearly 100 hours of training, most people are able to get to some pretty strong level of proficiency with this task. They're actually able to make a stone tool, which is quite an achievement to observe and to see, and people really love actually learning this skill. But what we looked at were two variables in particular that we were interested in. One was called model score. This is a score of the actual stone tool that they make. It is based on, is it symmetrical? Were you able to knock off the appropriate, what they're called flakes? So these little pieces of stone, are you able to knock them off in a logical and procedural way? Is the shape of the structure appropriate as well? Are you able to knock off parts of those shards of that rock in densities that are robust enough to be very effective at making the stone tool? And so what we saw was a pretty rapid increase in their model score. They're able to really, really get quite proficient at doing this very quickly. And what we think happens is about 50 hours of training, they get quite good. And then this little decrement is more because they're just perfecting the little nuances of the task. Then what we looked at was the coefficient of variation. We looked at a lot of different eye movement variables, but I'm only going to focus in on this one for now. The coefficient of variation basically indicates that through training, they're looking at a smaller area of the visual scene. And indeed, that's what happens. So when you go from their pre-phase to their post-1 and post-2, they're looking at a tighter window of the visual scene when they're watching someone else perform this task. Well, the question is, what part of the visual scene are they looking at, and why is it important? And here gives us a clue. So here's basically a coded video. This is the video that they watch. It's about 1,000 seconds long. This video was color coded by an anthropologist to highlight certain action phases that occur. So you're going back and forth, your core reposition maybe as you're moving the rock around that you're about to hit. A percussion is when you actually hit the two things together and things like this. And so what we asked people to do while they were watching this video was tell us what you think is important. When you're watching this video, what is fascinating to you when you see it? And during the post-1 and the post-2, the things that were fascinating to them were always this one in this, I don't know what color that is, lightish blue, I don't know, but it is called a core move. The core move is actually a tremendously important movement in this task, because you're taking this stone that you're trying to shape into a hand axe or something like that, and after you strike it, you turn it over to see how you did, okay? And that turn initially, for most people, they're focusing very heavily on what they knocked off the stone. But it actually becomes more important to look at that stone, because what you knock off reveals fault lines in the rock that if you hit against them again, the whole rock will crumble. So those fault lines become very important perceptually. But it's hard to teach somebody that. They have to know that. And so what we see is a decreasing variability where their eyes tend to focus much more, and it's not really shown here, but they tend to focus much more on that core movement, right? That ability to understand that when I flip that core over, I can see the fault lines and I can know how I need to strategize for my next hit. And that's something you can't really teach. And the similarity that we think about here is just like we're trying to teach somebody to use a prosthetic limb. There's certain aspects of that that I can't really verbalize well. I can't really explain well. You just have to experience it, and hopefully you pick it up, or you pick it up through somebody else, watching somebody else do it. And this is the kind of thing that we're talking about, the ability to use that visual information to actually help build those experiences and understand those experiences. And so while we use, going back to prostheses, while we use motor learning to understand processes to support prosthesis use, and obviously there's a lot of technology focusing on increasing sensation of the prosthesis, why not look at the visual and the sensory system, in this case, not just proprioceptive and tactile and things like that, but look at the visual system to understand how it might help support motor learning with these prostheses, particularly in the earliest days of therapy, as some of our preliminary data seems to show. And so with that, I'll wrap up. It seems as though gaze behavior does help to predict judgments of action goals. And we don't know which direction this goes yet, but we think that parietal frontal activity may be influenced or influence gaze behavior, and that gaze behavior may influence motor learning, particularly when we're looking at action observation approaches, for sure. And being able to see this through a couple different lenses of motor learning has been really helpful to really understand how we should move forward with this. And so with that, I'll stop. Certainly to thank a lot of good collaborators, both in the Atlanta area, particularly with the work we're doing in amputation, but also some good collaborations with colleagues in Italy and UC San Diego, as well as MRRI and University of Exeter on the stilled tube making work that we're continuing. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Lewis. That was really interesting. I'm wondering if others have some questions. I have one, but I'll wait and see if others want to jump in.
I'll ask a quick question while people are thinking as well. So if action observation is important for motor learning and might be therapeutically useful, but we don't know from this where we need to be observing yet. And I think one of the things you said was that this kind of innate, or you pick it up, I think was the word that you said.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like some kind of trial and error thing, which is, I guess, how we learn, from in child development and things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just trying to extract, how we could make that, where that might lead to, that could be therapeutically useful about how to use your eyes for action observation.
Yeah, and I think you're wrestling with what we've been wrestling with too a little bit. Is this a situation where, depending on what you're studying and how you're studying it, do you have to prime the person to look at these things? Or in other cases where perhaps it's more, I hate to use the word obvious, but when it's more clear, there are certain conditions such as amputation where maybe you don't have to prime people where to look. Maybe they kind of figure it out themselves. We're doing a similar study right now, well, we're picking it back up in stroke to see, because that's a very different case. The person they're observing is also going to have hands, right? And so it's not a situation where somebody has lost their hands, but we're looking at, is it possible that the degree of deficit could play a role in how much we need to maybe drive attention to something, or can they kind of figure out what things they particularly need to visualize and what things they particularly need to pull from what they're observing. So it's more of a kind of a client-driven point of view. If somebody knows what they need to look for, we guide them to see it if they can't extract it themselves.
And I was having a similar sort of thought or question in that I guess you're dealing, at least so far, with people whose visual information gathering systems are intact. But one of the observations that I've had just clinically with a fair number of patients with traumatic brain injury is that they behave without looking at what they're doing, and their gaze doesn't seem to be sort of automatically syncing with what information gathering is necessary to move the task forward. And then I guess that raises the question of whether for those patients, is it useful to try to train their gaze to be more functional, or is it more realistic to say, well, for those people, gaze isn't making the contributions that it might be making in the cases you're looking at, and that's not going to be a productive contribution for such a patient? So that seems like an important sort of sub question.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. And actually, I was talking to a colleague at a virtual conference on that very point, who is actually more interested in studying gaze from the point of view of how people use it during their own movements. So like, again, going back to that reach to grasp task, and how gaze may be helping to facilitate these kind of sub movements, or however you want to think about it. But yeah, it's the same question. If somebody isn't able to use their gaze system efficiently, what does that mean for these kind of studies? Is that person not capable of action observation? And is there actually a way to help that person? Maybe that could be a point of rehabilitation as well. So
I have a sort of, this is probably, it's interesting that several of us have questions in the same domain. So, because I think the cause and effect question is, of course, I know of great interest to you, Louis, because you talked a little bit about, is gaze itself driving motor learning and plasticity? But obviously, the other hypothesis is that gaze is reactive to the need to gather information as a way of testing hypotheses, ongoing hypotheses that the person has, that the brain has, about what's going on, what the meaning is, what's happening, what's going to happen next. And so without that theory, an active inference that
Mm-hmm.
the person has, the gaze is not going to behave in a way that's suitable for information gathering. So their gaze follows from the active inference. And so I'm just curious, because it sounds a couple of times you seem to flip that and say the gaze is important, and the gaze is what's driving learning. Can you expand on your thinking? Why do you think it works the other way?
Yeah, and this probably reflects what I've been wondering about myself. So there are certain occasions where it seems like at a very short time level, I mean by within a few trials, people really dramatically change their gaze in the prosthetic learning study, right? So and this is something I didn't show, and we're actually working on this paper right now, but it's not automatic, right? It's not as though gaze is just suddenly changing and we're able to work through this, but they're clearly picking up on something, and that evolves very quickly, very rapidly. We still don't know which one is leading or lagging in that situation, but actually, interestingly, in the stone tool study, it is the exact opposite. It seems like the people in that study get to some level of proficiency with the stone tool making, and then their gaze changes because they need to pull out some more information. And they're starting to maybe realize what information they need to pull out. It's almost like kind of having an ongoing questioning and data needing kind of issue with yourself, right? Where you're kind of thinking, I'm getting better, but I can't quite do this, or I'm getting better and I can't quite do that. What's the problem? The analogy I'll make that other people have seen with this is in sport. There's a beautiful set of studies in golf, actually, that has asked a very similar question and has suggested that you get to a certain level of proficiency naturally, perhaps, so to speak, and then suddenly you have to get much more invasive with your gaze to understand how you need to change these little subtleties of your actions to get dramatically better. But it takes some degree of motor change first in those cases. Why we're not quite seeing that in the prosthesis use is unclear. And so I don't really know.
I wondered
what the
if
answer
maybe
is.
the prosthesis, at least the one that you showed us, you suggested that a simple movement of the shoulders opens the prosthesis. And so you've got a very simple manipulation. It's centered on the shoulder. There's a single change in the movement. Whereas I think for this tool use, as you know, it's a much more complex, skilled action. So, I mean, I think maybe less learning is required to figure out the cause and effect when it comes to using the prosthesis. So you can get that quite early on.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly part of it. One of the things that's really interesting with these is that even people that are chronic amputees, they really struggle with the basic mechanisms of these prosthetic limbs. So the ability to open it is usually fine, but it's closing it and holding that grasp while you're trying to move about. There's a huge amount of motor learning going on there because you have to maintain some degree of flexion while you're doing these extension movements of the arm or things like that. So we're trying to, I mean, I think you're on to something here. And this is kind of what we've been wrestling with is what is that functional limit, perhaps, that our amputees are just kind of, they hit the wall and they can't get better. And maybe now is when they're able to really engage in something, but it's much more simplistic. It's more like this one little thing makes all the difference in the world for their performance.
I guess I'm wondering whether part of the different learning curves might have to do with what the visual system needs to do to be useful versus what the limb needs to do to be useful. And I mean, concretely, you're only coding in most of your studies whether the eyes are on this chunk, that chunk, or another chunk, right? So you're assuming, and probably rightly, that you don't necessarily have to foveally inspect every little detail of the bowl of the spoon to know it's the bowl of the spoon.
Right.
So I guess but you do have to perfect your actual posture and your actual amount of pressure opening and closing the hook and all that. So I guess what I'm asking is whether to some degree this is an artifact of what you need to learn for the gaze is just which end of things to look at when. That you, once you figure out, oh, that's what's relevant, boom, you're on it.
Right.
But you're not on it in perfecting the movement. Then you now know what to be watching trial to trial, but you still have to use that information to continue to refine your graph, your reach, your, you know, whatever it is you're watching. But you know where to watch very quickly, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's really right, and that's one of the big differences, certainly between the stone tool, aside from a lot of other things, obviously, for the stone tool study and the prosthesis use study. And that's why I wanted to show them as different gradations of the same concept, right? One that is incredibly esoteric for most people versus just simple reach to grasp to pick up things. There's a huge gulf in between there that we need to figure out and understand, and even just varying the tasks, right? So we started doing this before the pandemic, but having action observation with the task is constantly changing. How does that influence the ability to use AO in that case, and the ability to kind of maintain these visually supported benefits that we're thinking are going on in prosthesis use? If that reveals what we think it will reveal, I think it'll be really, really interesting to understanding how this benefit preserves itself.
Lewis, with regards to how the dependence on the visual gaze might change with time, like of those you know, a long period of time of acquiring or practicing a particular movement, I could understand that. That to me makes sense. You know, if you have an early dominance of vision as you're trying to figure out your amputee or stroke, you've got a new mechanical system that feels weird than, you know, pre-morbid. It was very different. So you're trying to figure that out. And you can imagine that as you start to rely more heavily on the get more used to the proprioceptive, then it's not so efficient to rely on the vision. That kind of makes sense to me. One other quick thing that I had was, just so that I understand, it's probably a simple question, but did I hear you correctly that, so you have the ice cream spoon and the ice cream. Did you say that people always gaze to the ice cream first and then the tool second?
Yes.
Yeah, so the people who don't study this, me, that's kind of news to me, and that's really interesting. So we kind of, I don't know, there's probably a more eloquent description of that, but that's interesting. And the other thing that you said that was intriguing for me is that the eyes led the hand. I could think of that as a therapeutic strategy early on. So you remember that you had I think, a motion capture and the eye tracking, and I could imagine early on that would be a fairly simple thing to do. Look here first, look there second, and try to, you know. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and one of the things about the tool, where their eyes go first, is interesting. So one of the things that we have planned to do next is actually to change where these tools and objects are in the visual scene, to play with that a little bit to see how reliable that is. One interpretation of that is almost like a reading interpretation. The object was always on the left, the tool is always on the right. Your eyes just kind of naturally always go from left to right. And so one of the things we're wondering is, okay, if we switch that up, do we still have that same reliance on the object first in the tool, or does it switch around? But yeah, I mean, those are certainly things we're interested in understanding, even at a very basic level.
Another hypothesis has to do with the importance of stabilizing the object that you're going to act upon with the tool. The first thing you got to do is get that object in hand so that you can then manipulate it or reach it or do whatever with the other hand.
Exactly.
That impedance control. And there's hemispheric, you know, Bob Steinberg's work has been, he's been quite interested in hemispheric specialization for impedance control, and the fact that the left hand stabilizes objects, in right-handers, by the way, stabilizes objects and controls their movement, while the right hand is important in this sort of planning of manipulation, the right hand left hemisphere.
And then we have to keep I was just going to say, we have to keep in mind that if vision leads action, that attention leads vision too. So the attentional system is moving to the location even before the eyes get there.
Yeah.
So
sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask another question? I apologize if I forgot. Did you only look at ice cream?
Oh, no. Yeah, there were many different stimuli. We had all kinds of stuff in there. We had hammers and nails. We had spoons and ice cream. We had probably about 20 different images that they looked at, 20 different correct tool object pairings that were the root images.
Okay, and they always looked at the object first, regardless of.
Yeah.
I wondered if it was sort of a reward value associated with the stimulus to modulate whether they. I didn't know.
No, it's a good question. Yeah. No. It was about 80% of the time that was a very, very stable result of this.
I think Erica had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I keep trying to jump in, someone else will come. But when you were talking about the action observation therapy stuff, you kind of alluded to like imagery of action as being one way to achieve that. And I was wondering if you've thought about kind of pitting like imagined action versus observed action, because that would maybe help you address the question about the importance of eye gaze. You know, presumably when imagining an action, I'm sure they're doing something with their eyes that's probably useful, but it'd be interesting to see if this, you know, if that answers questions about, you know, how gaze affects parietal involvement and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that's one of the things that we actually made a very calculated, I don't know if it was the right decision, but we made a calculated decision to not include the kind of mentalizing or imagery based training when we were first going down this road. But I certainly am interested in thinking more about how gaze works during that as well. I think that would be a really, really interesting way to understand the mechanisms of that as well, but also to pit it against what's happening, if there are differences with the action observation. Yeah, great question.
Other questions or comments?
Really interesting talk, great slides and, you know, beautiful figures. It's I appreciate all of the work that went into that. Thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you very much, Lewis. It's been
Absolutely.
a great pleasure to have you, and see you soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Y'all take care. Be safe, everyone.
Thank you.
You too.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot. Thanks again. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.